What if the person you thought was your enemy was the only one who could help you save the child you love? In a world of power, lies, and quiet acts of courage, one choice can change everything, and staying might be the bravest move of all. Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The harbor was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet Charleston gets in the early days of fall. A thin veil of mist clung to the water, softening the edges of the docked boats, making the world feel a little hushed. Marceline Hart pedaled her old blue bike along the brick-paved road, the front basket rattling with a loaf of bread and a paper bag of apples. She turned into the long, tree-lined driveway of Harborview Estate, the stately white mansion where she worked 5 mornings a week. At 29, she carried herself with a certain quiet determination. Marceline hadn't always cleaned kitchens or polished silver. Once, not long ago, she'd been a pediatric rehab nurse at Eastbridge Pediatric. She'd been good at it too, good enough to earn the trust of parents and the affection of her little patients. But after one of those patients didn't make it through an emergency surgery, something in her broke. The weight of it never really lifted. She left the hospital, and the title behind. A part-time housekeeping job paid the bills, kept her mind busy, and, most importantly, kept her at a safe distance from hospital hallways. Inside the estate, the air smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh laundry. Her duties were simple enough: the kitchen, the laundry, and helping keep an eye on 9-year-old Jonas Whitfield Jr. when the physical therapist wasn't around. Jonas had been in a wheelchair since the accident, both legs left without much strength or feeling. He was sharp, too sharp sometimes, and far too serious for a boy his age. She had only seen him smile a handful of times in the months she'd been there. This morning, while dust motes floated lazily in the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, Marceline put on a record. The low, easy sway of jazz filled the room. "Let's just see what happens," she told him softly, adjusting his hands on the armrests. Instead of the rigid therapy drills he hated, she coaxed him into shifting his weight to the rhythm, letting one foot press the floor, then the other. Little movements, almost like a dance. For a moment, something sparked in his face. Laughter that came out quick, surprised. His right foot lifted for a second longer than usual, and he looked at her with wide eyes, as if he couldn't quite believe it himself. She smiled back, warm and quiet, knowing full well that if Mr. Whitfield ever found out, there'd be questions she couldn't answer. The treatment plan was strict, clinical, not meant for music and games. But rules had never lit up a boy's face like that. From the hallway, she caught a flicker of movement. One of the security staff stood at the end of the corridor, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on them just a beat too long. There was no expression on his face, but something in the way he lingered sent a small chill down her spine. She kept smiling for Jonas, even as she felt the first hint of trouble sliding quietly into the room. The house had that kind of stillness you only notice when you've been inside it long enough, when every hum of the refrigerator, every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, becomes part of the air you breathe. The therapy room sat at the far end of the west wing, bathed in afternoon light. Sunbeams cut in through the tall glass panes, landing in wide golden stripes across the polished oak floor. Marceline stood behind Jonas, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. The old turntable in the corner spun a slow, soulful jazz record. The music wasn't loud, just enough to wrap around them like a soft blanket. Jonas's small fingers curled around hers, his eyes locked on his own sneakers, as if watching them would somehow help. "That's it," she said softly. "One foot, then the other. You're not rushing anywhere." His lips pressed into a thin line, but she saw the faintest spark in his face. A flicker of stubbornness, maybe even excitement. Slowly, he shifted his weight, letting his right foot press the floor before easing it back. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd done yesterday. The room felt alive in a way she hadn't seen in months. The music, the sunlight, the faint scent of lemon polish from the cleaning she'd done earlier. It all felt like possibility. Then the door banged open. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. Jonas jerked, losing his balance, and Marceline instinctively steadied him. Silas Whitfield filled the doorway, tall and solid in his dark blue suit, a navy tie hanging perfectly in place. His eyes, sharp and unblinking, swept over the scene, taking in his son's tentative movements and the faint sway of their bodies to the music. "What is this?" His voice was controlled, but each word was edged in steel. Marceline turned to face him. "You were doing something outside of his prescribed therapy," he cut her off, stepping into the room. His polished shoes clicked against the floor. "This is not a playground, Miss Hart. My son's recovery is not a matter of improvisation." Jonas looked up quickly, his voice small but firm. "Dad, it's not." "Jonas," Silas said sharply, holding up a hand. "Enough." The boy's shoulders sagged. Marceline's pulse quickened, but she kept her tone even. "Sometimes the structure isn't enough. The music helps him." "I don't care what you think helps," Silas said, his voice rising just enough to leave no doubt who was in charge. "You're here to follow instructions, not to play doctor, and certainly not to experiment." There was a pause. The air between them was thick. Then Silas delivered the final blow. "Pack your things. You're finished here. I want you out before the day is over." From the hall, just past his shoulder, Marceline caught sight of Mrs. Keller, the head housekeeper, hovering with a dust cloth in hand. The faintest curve of satisfaction crossed her face before she turned away. It was enough to confirm what Marceline had already suspected. Someone had been watching, waiting for her to slip. Her mouth was dry. She turned back to Jonas, kneeling slightly so she was level with him. "You're going to be fine," she said quietly, though the tremor in her hands betrayed her. She guided him back into his chair, locking the brakes, her eyes on his instead of Silas. Jonas bit his lip. "Marcy." His voice cracked on the second syllable, the kind of sound that caught in your chest and stayed there. She couldn't look back at him when she stood. She didn't trust herself not to stay if she did. The corridor felt longer than it ever had before. Each step toward the side entrance was heavy, the weight of the moment pressing down harder than her tote bag slung over her shoulder. The polished floors reflected her back in fragments as she passed, her own face pale and unreadable. Outside, the air carried a faint briny tang from the harbor. The gravel drive crunched under her sneakers as she headed for the bike rack at the far end. She reached for her keys, trying to focus on the simple act of leaving, when her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out without thinking. One new text message from an unknown number. "You think you can stick your nose into the Whitfield family's business?" Her thumb hovered over the screen, but she didn't type a reply. The words settled like ice in her chest. She stood there for a long moment, the hum of distant traffic mixing with the cries of gulls overhead. Whoever sent it knew exactly who she was and exactly what she'd been doing. This wasn't just about Silas catching her in the middle of a dance lesson. This was something larger, and it had been watching her longer than she'd realized. The wind shifted, carrying the faint rustle of the estate's tall oaks. She tightened her grip on the phone. The text still glowed on the screen, sharp and undeniable. Whatever was coming, it had only just begun, and she had the sinking feeling she was already in deeper than she'd ever intended. The chain on her bike clicked softly as Marceline coasted to a stop in front of Magnolia Brew, the kind of cafe that smelled like fresh pastries the moment you opened the door. She propped the bike against the rack, looped the lock through the frame, and stood for a second, just watching the scene through the window. Warm golden light spilled across the inside, landing in patches on the scarred wooden tables. People were tucked into corners with laptops and mugs of coffee, and for a moment she wished she could disappear among them, Just another stranger with nothing more on her mind than an unfinished work email. She pushed the door open and felt the whoosh of warm air on her cheeks. Her usual table by the window was free. She slid into the seat, set her laptop bag down, and pulled out her phone. Jonas's photo stared back at her from the screen. Him sitting in the wheelchair, chin tipped down, eyes catching the light like they had when he laughed that morning in the therapy room. The memory ached. She spread her resume and cover letters across the table, but her eyes kept drifting back to the picture. The guilt sat heavy in her stomach. She'd left without a word that mattered, without telling him why, or that she would have stayed if she could. And with that guilt came something darker. A familiar fear she thought she'd buried. The same fear that had gripped her after losing that little boy in the hospital. The one whose face she still saw when she closed her eyes. That sense of having abandoned someone who needed her most. It was like a pulse in her ears, steady and relentless. The laptop chimed with a new email. She clicked without thinking, but it wasn't a job offer or an update from an old friend. It was a local news alert. Household worker under investigation after incident with disabled child. Her breath caught. The article was short, littered with phrases like potential misconduct and serious concerns, accompanied by a grainy still from what had to be the estate's security footage. It showed a blurred figure, her, bent toward Jonas. Out of context, it could be anything. And of course, the comments underneath were already a mob. She's dangerous. Shouldn't be anywhere near children. Looks unstable to me. Each one chipped at her chest. She set the laptop aside, fingers curling into her palms under the table. Then her phone buzzed. A text from an unfamiliar number. "It's me, Jonas. I know you didn't do anything wrong. I'll find a way to see you." She stared at the words, feeling an unexpected rush of warmth. And right on its heels, worry. If he tried to contact her and his father found out, it could make things even worse for him. She typed, erased, typed again, then set the phone face down. From the corner of her eye, she caught movement. Across from her, at a table near the door, a man in a tweed jacket sat reading the newspaper. At first, he seemed entirely uninterested in her, but then in the faint reflection of the glass beside him, she saw it. His phone angled ever so slightly in her direction, the flicker of a camera screen. Her pulse jumped. She lifted her gaze fully to him. He looked up from the paper, caught her eye, and smiled like any polite stranger might. Then he folded the paper neatly, tucked it under his arm, and walked out, the door chiming softly behind him. She sat very still, the warmth from Jonas's message still lingering in her chest, now tangled with something colder. Whoever he was, he hadn't been there for the coffee. Outside, the man turned the corner and vanished from view. She could still feel the faint prickle along the back of her neck, the kind that tells you you're being watched, maybe for the first time, maybe for longer than you realize. In the therapy room at Harborview Estate, the late afternoon light stretched across the floor in long, pale stripes. Jonas sat in his wheelchair, his hands resting on the armrests while Dr. Hale, the physical therapist, counted out the rhythm for a series of knee lifts. Again, left leg, hold for 3, now right. Jonas obeyed, but his eyes weren't on his legs. They kept drifting toward the tall window across the room. He could still picture her there, Marceline, leaning against the frame with that steady, patient smile. She never rushed him, never barked counts like they were orders. Instead, she made the room feel lighter, like the work wasn't just work. With her, the air had moved to the sway of jazz, and every small success felt like a celebration. Now, the room felt like an empty gym. The only sound was Dr. Hale's voice and the squeak of rubber soles on polished wood. He tried to focus, but his legs felt heavier, the exercises dull and endless. A few more repetitions, and he asked to stop. The therapist sighed, but didn't push it. Down the hall, in his office, Silas Whitfield clicked through his morning emails. One subject line made his jaw tighten. "For your eyes only." Inside was a single image, Marceline, caught on the estate security feed, leaving with a large tote slung over her shoulder. The angle made it look like it could be heavy. The caption read, "You might want to check what went missing." Silas stared at it for a long moment. He didn't remember authorizing anyone to send him this. The image was time-stamped the afternoon she'd been fired. His chest tightened. Not just with anger, but with that particular kind of suspicion that comes when the pieces fit too neatly. He told himself it was probably nothing, but then told himself it could be everything. By the time the clock hit 3, he'd ordered the head of security to step up surveillance and hire Dean Collard, a private investigator with a reputation for getting answers, quietly and quickly. "Find out what she's doing, who she's talking to, and if she still has anything that belongs to me," Silas said into the phone. "I want a full report." That evening, Jonas sat at his desk, the window cracked to let in the smell of the magnolias blooming outside. He pulled a piece of lined notebook paper from his drawer and gripped his pen hard enough to make his knuckles ache. The words didn't come easily, but when they did, they were short and certain. "You told me once quitting means losing everything. Are you coming back?" He folded the paper in thirds, slid it into an envelope, and scrawled her name on the front. Then, heart hammering, he wheeled himself down the hall when no one was watching. The mailroom door was unlocked. He tucked the envelope into the outgoing bin and slipped away before anyone noticed. The next afternoon, on the other side of town, Marceline sat cross-legged on the floor of her small apartment, sorting through job listings she'd printed from the library. Most were dead ends, low pay, long hours, nothing stable. She was starting to think about leaving Charleston altogether, maybe heading north where no one knew her name. A knock came at the door. The mail carrier handed her a small bundle, the plain envelope sitting on top. She recognized Jonas's handwriting instantly. She sat on the couch, her thumb tracing the edge of the paper before opening it. "You told me once quitting means losing everything. Are you coming back?" Her throat tightened. She read it twice, 3 times, before she noticed something else tucked inside, a photo. It was grainy, taken from a high window. In the foreground, the magnolia trees outside the estate's east wing. In the lower corner, barely visible, a man in a tweed jacket, his head turned just enough for her to see part of his face. Her stomach sank. She'd seen that face before. Magnolia Brew. The newspaper. The quick smile before he walked out. She set the letter down on the coffee table and stared at the photograph, her pulse thudding in her ears. Whoever he was, he hadn't just followed her to the cafe. He'd been watching her at the estate, maybe even before Silas fired her. The idea crawled over her skin like a shadow that wouldn't lift. She looked back at Jonas's words, at the way his small, uneven letters pressed into the paper. It was a reminder of why she couldn't just vanish. But now she knew. If she stayed, she'd have to find out who was really watching her, and why. The wind funneled down the narrow streets of Charleston's historic district, rattling loose shutters and carrying the smell of the harbor. Marceline kept her hands deep in her coat pockets, her bag slung across her shoulder as she made her way home. The old bricks underfoot were slick from the morning rain, and she walked with the kind of quick, purposeful steps you take when you're ready to be somewhere safe. Halfway down Bay Street, she cut past a narrow alley to save time. That's when she heard it. Footsteps behind her, heavy enough to echo against the walls. She glanced over her shoulder. A black SUV sat idling at the curb, windows tinted so dark she couldn't see inside. The low hum of the engine lingered in her ears as she turned away and quickened her pace. By the time she reached her building, her heart was beating faster than her stride. The SUV hadn't followed her all the way, but the image stuck in her mind. She climbed the narrow staircase to her second-floor walk-up, the sound of each step echoing in the stairwell. When she reached her door, a knock came from the other side, short, sharp, and unexpected. A deliveryman stood there, holding a large envelope. "For you," he said, offering it without making eye contact. "No return address. No name." She closed the door, slid the lock, and stood in the middle of the room for a moment before opening it. Inside was a neat stack of papers. At the top, in bold, was her name. Below that, legal language that made her stomach knot. It was an official notice. Silas Whitfield had filed a petition for a psychiatric evaluation, citing behavior posing a danger to a disabled minor. She sank into the edge of the bed, the weight of the document pressing down harder than the paper itself. She thought of the medical bills still sitting unpaid, the years of school she'd put in for her nursing degree, the career she'd already lost once. If a judge signed off on this, she'd be branded unstable. No hospital, no clinic, no family would trust her with a child again. The world she'd been trying to rebuild would vanish before she'd even had the chance to stand on it. Her phone buzzed. She didn't want to look, but curiosity got the better of her. It was a notification from a news site. One she hadn't followed, but that had a knack for catching scandal early. The headline stopped her cold. Former Whitfield employee caught in disturbing incident. She tapped it. A short video played, grainy security footage from the estate's therapy room. It showed Jonas tipping sideways in his chair, his body sliding toward the floor. The clip ended there, abruptly. A red banner across the bottom read, "When trust turns dangerous." She knew exactly what had happened that day. Jonas had been reaching for a ball, laughing when the chair rolled forward. She'd been right there, catching him before he hit the ground. But in the chopped-up version on the screen, there was no laughter, no catching, just the fall. The comments section was a hive of outrage. "She's a danger to him. Keep her away from kids forever. This woman needs serious help." Some comments went further, dragging her name through the kind of mud you can't wash off. Her hands clenched until her nails pressed into her palms. The phone rang before she could close the video. She almost didn't answer, expecting another unknown number, but the name on the screen stopped her. Rachel Moreau. She hadn't heard from her in years, not since they'd both worn scrubs. Marceline picked up. "Rachel? Hey." Rachel's voice was firm, no wasted words. "I saw the article. I'm guessing you've seen the papers too." Marceline swallowed. "He's trying to." "He's not just trying," Rachel cut in. "This is in motion, and it's going to get ugly fast. You need to come to my office tomorrow morning." Marceline leaned forward, pressing her elbow to her knee. "And if I don't?" There was a pause. Then Rachel said, "If you want to survive this, you'll be there. But you need to be ready. This isn't just a lawsuit. It's a campaign. Someone's decided you're going to be the villain, and they've already started writing the script." The line went quiet except for the faint hiss of background noise. Marceline didn't answer right away. She didn't have to. Rachel knew she'd come. She set the phone down and stared at the papers again. Outside, the wind rattled the loose pane in her window, like the city itself was reminding her there was no such thing as a closed door anymore. Rachel's office sat on the third floor of an old brick building that faced the harbor. The windows rattled faintly in the wind, the smell of salt water drifting in through a cracked pane. Inside, every available surface seemed buried under stacks of case files, legal pads, and an open laptop with half a dozen tabs blinking in the background. Rachel stood behind her desk, sliding a thick folder toward Marceline. "Look at this," she said, tapping the pages. "I traced the IP addresses from the accounts posting about you. They all point back to the same network, a senior employee at Whitfield and Mason." Marceline leaned over the desk, scanning the printouts. Her stomach tightened. "So this isn't just random gossip." "No," Rachel said flatly. "It's coordinated. And if you keep your head down, You're letting them write your story for you. Once that happens, the truth won't matter. Marceline crossed her arms, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. If I fight back, it's going to get worse for Jonas. He'll be stuck in the middle. And I can't. Rachel cut her off. He's already in the middle. They're using him as the reason to destroy you. The only way to protect him is to take control of the narrative before it crushes both of you. Marceline looked toward the window. The harbor was speckled with sunlight, boats rocking gently against the docks. She could almost imagine a life somewhere else, where no one knew her name, where this fight didn't exist. But that image shattered when the phone on Rachel's desk rang. Rachel frowned at the caller ID. It's a landline. Weird. She picked up. Rachel Moreau. Her eyes flicked to Marceline as she held the receiver out. It's for you. Marceline hesitated before taking it. Hello? The voice on the other end was small but unmistakable. It's me. Jonas's breathing was uneven, like he'd been holding back tears. The doctor says I'm not going to be able to walk. Dad says it's your fault. His voice cracked, and she heard the sound of him trying to muffle a sob. He says I was doing better before you ruined it. Her throat closed. Jonas, that's not. But he'd already hung up. The dial tone hummed in her ear. She stood there for a long moment, the receiver still in her hand, the words echoing in her head. That one call cut deeper than any headline, deeper than any legal threat. If they'd convinced him of that, they could take away everything she'd fought for. Not just her reputation, but the one thing that mattered more than any job. She set the phone down with deliberate care. All right, she said, turning to Rachel. You're my attorney. We fight. Rachel's lips curved, not quite into a smile, but into something close. Good. Then we start now. I want a full statement from you, every detail, and we'll move from there. For the next hour, they mapped out a strategy. Press contacts Rachel could trust, a counter-narrative backed by hard evidence, and the beginnings of a legal defense that could stand up to whatever Silas's team threw at them. It wasn't much yet, but it was a start, and Marceline felt a flicker of something she hadn't let herself feel: resolve. As the sun dipped lower, she gathered her bag and stepped out into the hallway. The smell of coffee from the cafe downstairs drifted up, mingling with the cool evening air. She was halfway down the stairwell when a woman stepped into her path. Tall, with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a tailored coat, she carried herself like someone used to being noticed. Marceline recognized her from somewhere, though not in person. Marceline Hart? The woman asked, her voice smooth but edged. Yes, Marceline said slowly. I'm Angela Cross, the woman said, offering a card with a glossy logo. I know you're not the villain they're painting you as, but I also know exactly who benefits from you disappearing. She tilted her head slightly, studying Marceline's face. The question is, do you want to know? The wind from the open door downstairs stirred between them, carrying the scent of the harbor and something else. Possibility, or maybe trouble. Marceline didn't answer right away. Angela didn't say much as she led Marceline down a narrow street in Charleston's French Quarter. The air was thick with the smell of the nearby harbor, carrying a faint tang of salt mixed with the distant aroma of frying seafood. They stopped at a small bar tucked between two shuttered antique shops. Its faded sign swung lightly in the wind. Inside, the lighting was dim, the glow of amber bulbs spilling over brick walls that looked older than the city's streetlights. The air carried a comforting mix of aged wood, polished brass, and the sharp bite of whiskey. A few patrons sat hunched over their drinks, each wrapped in their own quiet world. Angela picked a corner booth, the kind where shadows softened the edges of faces. She slid into the seat and set her bag on the table. This isn't the kind of place the Whitfields send their friends, she said, her tone low but deliberate. That's why we're here. Marceline sat across from her, unsure if she was ready to hear what came next. "You said you know who's behind this," she said quietly. Angela didn't answer right away. Instead, she unzipped her bag and pulled out a slim black USB stick. She set it between them like it weighed far more than it should. "This is from a maintenance camera at Harborview Estates parking lot. One of the few they forgot to connect to their main system. I had someone retrieve it before it disappeared." Marceline's pulse quickened. "What's on it?" Angela slid a small laptop from her bag, plugged in the USB, and turned the screen toward Marceline. Grainy black and white footage filled the screen. A man in a dark jacket approached Dean Collard, the investigator who'd been trailing her. They stood beside a black SUV, the trunk open just enough to show the shape of a briefcase inside. The man handed Dean a thick envelope. Dean counted the bills with casual precision, then shook hands before walking away. "That," Angela said, tapping the screen, "was 3 days before those anonymous accounts started flooding the internet with your so-called dangerous behavior." Marceline stared at the image, feeling her stomach twist. "Who is he?" Angela clicked pause and zoomed in just enough for the man's profile to come into view. Henry Klein, senior manager at Whitfield Mason Properties, old friend of Silas. More importantly, he has clearance to access certain files, including Jonas's medical records. The weight of the words settled between them. Marceline leaned back, her palms pressing into the worn leather seat. "So this isn't just about Silas thinking I crossed a line. This was planned." Angela nodded. "Planned and paid for. And if I had to guess, it's not just about getting rid of you. It's about making sure no one starts asking questions about what's really going on with Jonas's health." The thought made Marceline's chest tighten. She remembered the little shifts in Jonas's demeanor during therapy, the way he sometimes seemed tired beyond what the exercises should cause. She'd assumed it was the emotional weight of recovery, but now she wasn't so sure. "If I go public with this," she said slowly, "Silas will drag Jonas into the spotlight. The press will swarm him. He doesn't deserve that." "And if you don't," Angela countered, "they win. They keep their hands clean. You disappear, and Jonas grows up believing you abandoned him. Sometimes the only way to protect someone is to make noise. So much noise they can't bury the truth." Marceline's mind swirled with both possibilities, neither of them clean, neither without consequence. She could already picture the headlines, the interviews, the inevitable smear campaigns. But she could also see Jonas, looking at her with the same trust he'd had in those moments when he'd taken his first tentative steps to the sound of jazz. Angela leaned forward, her voice softening just enough to cut through Marceline's thoughts. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just giving you the piece you've been missing." She slid the USB across the table. "The decision's yours. But remember, silence is still an answer." The tiny drive felt cold in Marceline's hand. Outside, the faint hum of the harbor traffic filtered in through the cracked door, mingling with the muffled chatter of the bar. Somewhere deep in her chest, a decision was beginning to form, but it was tangled in too many threads to pull free just yet. She closed her fingers around the USB. Whatever came next, she knew one thing. There was no going back. The rain hadn't let up since late afternoon. It hammered against the window of Marceline's tiny kitchen, the sound folding in on itself until it felt like a constant, pressing hum in her ears. She sat at the narrow table, the flickering light above throwing shadows across the chipped linoleum. In front of her, the USB drive sat like a piece of contraband, small, unassuming, but carrying the weight of something that could ruin lives. The storm outside seemed to mirror the one inside her chest. Every so often, thunder cracked so loud it rattled the glass, as if nature itself was reminding her that time was running out. She stared at the USB, half expecting it to whisper to her, to make the choice for her. But it didn't. A sharp knock at the door made her flinch. She hesitated, then opened it to find the bodega delivery guy, dripping wet, holding a large manila envelope. "For you," he said simply, before turning back into the rain. She closed the door and tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, thick, slightly crumpled from the journey. It was a child's drawing done in bright crayon strokes. A stick-figure version of her and Jonas standing on a sandy shoreline, a sun arcing over their heads. Above them, written in wobbly letters, were 3 words: "Don't leave me." The drawing was nothing like the pristine, cheerful artwork kids made in school. The lines were shaky, the figures leaning toward each other as if afraid to be pulled apart. The blue crayon of the ocean bled into the yellow of the sand in hurried streaks. Marceline ran her finger over the paper, feeling the faint ridges where the crayon had pressed hard into the page. She could almost see him, sitting at a desk somewhere in that cold, echoing estate, gripping the crayon too tightly because his small hands were shaking. Her throat tightened. The decision she'd been avoiding all day loomed over her like the thunderclouds outside. Option 1. Give Rachel the USB in the morning and let her use it as evidence. That meant war. Silas would unleash every resource at his disposal to bury her. And Jonas would be caught in the middle of a media frenzy. His privacy would shatter. His life would change forever. Option 2. Keep it hidden, disappear quietly, and protect him from the fallout. But that meant letting them win. Letting them write her story for her. And Jonas, he'd grow up believing she'd walked away when he needed her most. She closed her eyes, but the drawing was still there behind her eyelids. That uneven sun, those 2 small figures by the sea. She remembered his voice, soft but stubborn. "You said giving up is losing everything." The rain had eased by the time she made up her mind. She'd take the USB to Rachel. Let them come for her if they had to. She wasn't going to let a boy's trust be another casualty in her life. The decision filled her with a strange, restless energy. She packed her bag, double-checking the inside pocket where she'd tucked the drive. Then she slipped into bed, telling herself that in the morning, she'd walk into Rachel's office and hand over the truth. But when she woke, the air in the room felt wrong. Too still, too quiet. The lock on her apartment door hung at an odd angle, the metal bent in just enough to show it had been forced. Her pulse spiked. She went straight to the kitchen table and unzipped her bag. The pocket where the USB had been was empty. For a long moment, she just stood there, her breath catching against the sudden vacuum in her chest. Then she noticed it, something white on the floor near the door. She picked it up. It was a scrap of paper, torn from a notepad. The handwriting was jagged, impatient, written in a black pen that had left blotches where the ink pressed too hard. "You don't know what you're fighting against." The words seemed to hum in her head, colder than the rain-soaked air seeping in through the broken doorframe. Whoever had taken the USB hadn't done it just to stop her. They wanted her to know she was already in over her head. She set the note down, her fingers trembling, and realized the crossroads she'd been dreading was gone. Someone else had chosen the path for her. The heat came early that morning, pressing down like a damp blanket over Charleston. By the time Marceline reached Rachel's office, sweat clung to her hairline, and her shirt stuck to her back. But it wasn't the weather making her chest feel so heavy. It was the hollow weight of showing up empty-handed. The USB was gone, and with it, her one clean shot at proving she wasn't the monster everyone wanted her to be. Inside, Rachel was mid-argument, pacing with her phone pressed hard to her ear. "I told you to hold it until Friday. No, I don't care what the editor says. If you run it now, you'll be handing them our heads on a platter." She caught sight of Marceline at the door, lifted a finger in a silent just wait, and kept going. Marceline stood by the window, watching the harbor below, the glint of sunlight bouncing off the water. She thought about the way she'd imagined this morning. Walking in, dropping the USB on Rachel's desk, feeling that rare flash of control. Instead, her hands were empty, and her stomach churned with the knowledge that the clock was ticking toward the psychiatric evaluation Silas's lawyers had set up. Once that happened, they'd twist the results until unstable was the only word anyone heard. When Rachel hung up, she didn't bother sitting down. "Please tell me you've got the drive." Marceline shook her head. "Someone broke into my place last night. It's gone." The silence that followed was worse than the scolding she expected. Rachel exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Then we have a problem, because the narrative's turning fast." She reached for her laptop, spinning it around so Marceline could see the news feed. Across half a dozen outlets, Jonas's face filled the screen, small, pale, sitting in his wheelchair with a faraway look in his eyes. The headline read, "Boy refuses therapy after caretaker's dismissal." Below, words like emotional collapse and irreversible setback jumped out in bold. "They're framing it like you poisoned him against his own recovery," Rachel said quietly. Marceline's throat tightened. "And people believe it?" Rachel gave a humorless laugh. "They don't need to believe it. They just need to hear it enough." The media storm was worse than she'd imagined. Social feeds scrolled past with people either condemning her or demanding to know what really happened. Strangers had turned Jonas into a weapon without caring about the boy inside the headlines. Before she could answer, the door opened. Dean Collard stepped in, looking exactly as he had the first time she saw him. Creased khakis, windbreaker, sunglasses tucked into the collar of his shirt. Only this time, his eyes darted to the corners of the room before landing on her. Rachel stood instantly, her voice sharp. "You're trespassing." Dean lifted his hands. "Relax. I'm not here on Silas's dime anymore." Marceline's pulse kicked up. "So what do you want?" He took a slow breath. "To tell you that, yeah, I followed you. Yeah, I broke into your place and took the USB. But I didn't do it because Silas told me to. Somebody else put me on that job. And now, they're turning on me too." Rachel's gaze narrowed. "Somebody else?" Dean nodded. "The same somebody who's been feeding stories to the press and making sure the dirt sticks. And I've got something that might help you, if you're willing to take it." From his jacket, he pulled a small plastic case and slid it across Rachel's desk. "Copy of internal security footage from Harbor View Estate. A friend of mine pulled it before the system wiped. You'll want to look at the file labeled Tuesday_5 p.m. Rachel snapped the case open, eyeing the tiny memory card inside. "What's on it?" Dean glanced at Marceline. A conversation between a Whitfield family member and one of their own company staff. Short, but enough to tell you that this wasn't about some accident in the gym. It's about getting you out, permanently. Marceline leaned back in her chair, the walls of the room seeming to tilt around her. For weeks, she'd been building her anger towards Silas, imagining him as the single architect of her destruction. But Dean's tone, and the weight in Rachel's expression, made her realize the truth might be worse. This wasn't just one man's grudge. There was another hand in the shadows, maybe several, pulling strings she hadn't even seen. And if that was the case, Silas Whitfield might not be the one she needed to fear most. The late afternoon light slanted through Rachel's blinds, casting thin stripes across her desk. Marceline sat rigid in the chair opposite, her fingers knotted together so tightly her knuckles ached. Rachel didn't say a word at first, just slid the memory card Dean had given them into her laptop. The screen flickered, loading the grainy security footage. The picture was poor, low light, the camera set at an awkward angle. But the audio was sharp. There was the faint hum of an air conditioner, the creak of leather as someone shifted in their seat, and then a voice. Calm, controlled, poisoned with certainty. Get that woman out of Jonas's life before she ruins everything. Silas will never know. The words seemed to echo long after they'd ended. Marceline's breath stalled in her chest. She leaned forward, trying to make sense of the blurred figure in the shadows. Rachel hit pause. I thought you should hear it before I showed you the metadata. A few keystrokes later, the name appeared on the screen. Vivian Mason. Marceline knew the name. Everyone in Charleston's upper circles did. Silas's older cousin. Always in tailored silk. Always with a champagne glass at benefits she didn't even care about. More importantly, Vivian was the largest shareholder in Whitfield, Mason Properties. She wasn't just wealthy, she was entrenched. Rachel didn't sugarcoat it. She's the one behind this mess. And her motive isn't personal, it's business. The dirtiest kind. As Rachel talked, the scheme unfolded like a rot spreading under fresh paint. Vivian needed Jonas dependent on that wheelchair. As long as his care consumed Silas's time and resources, he'd stay tied to Charleston. He wouldn't restructure the company or sell assets, moves that might reduce Vivian's control. Keeping Jonas from walking was as much a power play as it was a cruelty. Marceline felt her pulse drum in her ears. So all of this, the accusations, the videos, the evaluation, it wasn't just about smearing me. It was to make sure Jonas never got better. Rachel nodded, eyes narrowing. And Silas? He made it easy for her. His prejudice, his temper, they were all she needed to make you the villain. The words landed hard. For weeks, Marceline had carried Silas in her mind like a shadow looming over her every step. Now she realized he was both the enemy and a pawn. Dangerous because of how easily he'd believe the worst. Her stomach turned. If I take this to him, he'll think I'm trying to save my own skin. Rachel's voice was steady. Then you make him see it's about Jonas. You think Vivian's going to stop if you walk away? She wins, Jonas loses, and every single thing you did for that boy will be erased. Before Marceline could respond, her phone buzzed. The name on the screen froze her. Jonas. She picked up instantly. His voice was small, hesitant. Are you really going to disappear? The question hit deeper than anything Vivian had orchestrated. Jonas, because if you do, he cut in, then they're right. Everyone who said you were just passing through, like everyone else. His voice cracked, carrying the hollow ache of a boy who had learned too early that adults don't always stay. She wanted to tell him no. She wanted to promise. But her throat tightened, and silence filled the line. When he finally hung up, she kept the phone to her ear, as if it could somehow bridge the gap between them. For a moment, she considered running, packing her bag, vanishing from Charleston, leaving this web of money and lies behind. But Jonas's trembling voice replayed in her mind, each word a tether pulling her back. She pushed away from the desk. I'm going to the estate. Rachel's brows drew together. Now. Yes, I'm bringing him the clip. If we're going to stop Vivian, I need Silas to see the truth with his own eyes. Rachel leaned back, exhaling slowly. You realize you'll be walking into his stronghold? If he doesn't believe you, you'll be out the door before you can hit play. Marceline stood, sliding the USB copy into her bag. Then I'll make sure he hears it before he has the chance to throw me out. This started in that house. It's going to end there. As she left the office, the humid Charleston air wrapped around her, thick and heavy, like a warning. The streets shimmered with the heat of a long summer day, but her chest felt cold. She thought about the first time she'd stepped into Harborview Estate, how she'd felt dwarfed by its marble floors and echoing halls. Now, walking back in would mean stepping into the lion's den. Only this time, she wasn't prey. She was carrying something sharp enough to cut through the lies. She had no idea if Silas would meet her with fury or disbelief. But she knew this much. Jonas's voice, his hope, was worth gambling everything. And if Vivian Mason thought she could hide behind the family name forever, she was about to find out what it felt like to have the mirror crack in her own hands. The sky hung low and heavy, clouds bruised with the weight of late afternoon rain. Marceline stood on the stone path leading to Harborview Estate, her coat pulled tight against the damp breeze. The familiar iron gates had opened reluctantly, and now the front door loomed tall, dark wood gleaming in the dim light. The butler opened it, his posture as rigid as ever, but there was something sharper in his gaze now, like he was bracing himself for trouble. Without a word, he stepped aside, and Marceline crossed the threshold, her shoes echoing on the marble floor. Silas was waiting in the sitting room, standing by the mantel as if he'd been carved there. His arms were crossed, and his jaw was set like stone. "You've got exactly 2 minutes," he said, his voice flat. Marceline didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulling out the USB Dean had given her. "You need to see this." "I don't need," he began, but she had already slid the drive into the small laptop she'd brought, the screen glowing between them. The video flickered, grainy and low-lit, but the audio filled the room. "Get that woman out of Jonas's life before she ruins everything. Silas will never know." The words rang out, clear, deliberate, and dripping with intent. Silas's brow furrowed, his mouth tightening into a line. "What is this supposed to be?" "Your cousin," Marceline said, her tone steady. "Vivian Mason." "That's ridiculous," he snapped. "This could be anyone." "Listen again," she cut in. She replayed the clip and leaned forward. "Hear the part where she talks about selling shares? About Jonas's wheelchair? That's not an accident, Silas. She's been working to keep him from walking. Because if you focus on your son, you might shift your attention from the company. And that would mean losing her control." His gaze shifted, just barely. But it was enough for Marceline to see the crack in his certainty. He turned toward the window, one hand flexing against the mantel. "This is edited," he muttered, but there was no bite in his voice now. "It has to be." "Maybe," Marceline said quietly. "But you know her. You know what she's capable of. You've seen how she moves when she wants something. You just never thought it would be Jonas in her way." He didn't respond, but his stillness felt heavier than anger. "I'm not here to make you like me," she went on. "I'm not here to win back my job or clear my name. I'm here because your son is caught in a game that has nothing to do with him, and everything to do with you. So you have to decide, is he going to have a protector, or just another man who tells him what to do?" Her words hung between them like the pause before a storm. Silas finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. For the first time since she'd met him, his authority seemed to falter. She could almost see the choice forming in his mind. Cling to the fortress of his family name, or step into the mess for Jonas's sake. When he spoke, his voice was lower. "Leave. I'll handle this." Marceline didn't move. "If you bury this, Vivian wins. And Jonas loses more than you can imagine." "I said I'll handle it," he repeated, sharper this time. But his eyes, they weren't the same. They didn't hold the flat, dismissive coldness she'd come to expect. There was something else there now, an unease he couldn't quite hide. She gave a short nod, then turned for the door. The butler was already there, holding it open. The air outside was thick with the smell of rain, and as she stepped onto the stone path again, she didn't feel the crushing defeat she'd braced for. Because even though the door had closed behind her with a solid, echoing slam, she knew it wasn't locked. Not anymore. That night, the city seemed to hold its breath. The streets outside Whitfield Mason properties were quiet, the hum of traffic reduced to a distant murmur. Inside the top-floor office, the glow from the city lights bled through tall windows, throwing long shadows across polished mahogany. Silas stood by the conference table, a stiff glass of whiskey in his hand. Across from him, Vivian leaned against the leather chair at the head of the table, her pearl earrings catching the dim light. "You went too far," Silas said, his voice low but sharp enough to cut. "You meddled in Jonas's life, and you dragged an innocent woman through the mud to do it." Vivian's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Jonas's life is my concern when it affects the company. You've been slipping, Silas, letting sentiment cloud your judgment. Sentiment. He stepped forward, setting his glass down with a heavy thud. You deliberately kept my son in that chair. You. Oh, please. She waved a manicured hand as if brushing away dust. You've always been too ready to believe the worst about me. But maybe you should be more concerned about what happens if certain documents find their way to the press. Silas's eyes narrowed. What documents? Her gaze sharpened. Financial irregularities. Letters. A few personal notes that paint you in a less than responsible light. If I have to, I'll make sure the court see you as unfit to raise Jonas. You wouldn't dare. You know I would. The air between them was charged, heavy with years of buried resentment. Outside, in the dim hallway, Dean stood close to the door, a small recording device in his pocket. He caught every word, his jaw tightening as the conversation spiraled. When Vivian leaned in and hissed something about owning the boy's future, Dean slipped away, pulling out his phone. "Rachel, I've got it," he whispered as he ducked into the stairwell. "Everything. Enough to take her down." But before Rachel could respond, a low growl of an engine echoed from the street below. Dean reached the front doors just as a black SUV with no plates came around the corner too fast. It swerved toward him, tires screeching. He dropped his phone as he bolted for the alley, his footsteps slapping against wet pavement. The SUV roared after him, but the night swallowed him before they could close in. In her apartment, Marceline's phone rang. Rachel's voice came through urgent. "Dean's safe, but we have the recording. Marceline, it's enough to destroy Vivian. The problem is, Silas will go down with her. And if that happens, Jonas." Marceline didn't need her to finish. The picture was already clear. Tabloids, endless interviews. Jonas caught in the center like a moth trapped in glass. She sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the worn photograph she kept tucked inside her wallet. Jonas, grinning wide, mid-step with her holding his hand steady. She remembered the light in his eyes that day, the way he'd whispered, "I feel taller already." Her chest ached. This wasn't about her anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. "You're saying if I let you release this, Jonas gets hurt," she said slowly. "Yes," Rachel answered. "If we wait, we might find a cleaner way. But waiting means trusting Silas to act without being forced. And you know his track record." Marceline closed her eyes for a moment, hearing both Rachel's words and Jonas's voice from their last call. "Are you really going to disappear?" When she opened them, the decision was already there. Not perfect, not clean, but hers. She picked up her phone and scrolled to Silas's number. When he answered, his tone was wary. "Marceline, I have a way to end this," she said, her voice steady. "But you're going to have to trust me, just this once." Silence, then a short, measured reply. "You have my attention." She glanced again at the photograph before slipping it back into her wallet. "Because we're running out of time." The morning air outside Charleston County Courthouse felt heavy, thick with the scent of impending rain. News vans lined the curb, their satellite dishes raised like curious birds. Reporters crowded the stone steps, calling out names, their cameras clicking in rapid bursts. Marceline walked up the path with Rachel by her side. She wore a simple white button-down tucked neatly into dark slacks, a gray coat draped over her shoulders. Her hair was pulled back, not a strand out of place. She didn't smile, didn't scowl, just moved forward with the quiet resolve of someone who'd already made peace with the road ahead. Inside, the marble-floored lobby echoed with the shuffle of polished shoes and the low hum of voices. Court officers guided people through metal detectors, while clusters of lawyers murmured strategy in the corners. Marceline's eyes scanned the crowd once, then settled straight ahead. Vivian Mason swept in minutes later, flanked by two attorneys in tailored suits. Her emerald dress coat caught the light like a signal flare, her heels clicking sharply against the stone. She carried herself like the verdict had already been signed in her favor. Her gaze found Marceline, lingered for the briefest moment, then moved on, dismissive, as if she'd just glanced at an inconvenience rather than an opponent. Rachel leaned toward her. "She thinks this is over," she whispered. Marceline didn't answer. Her heartbeat was steady. She had come with more than hope. While the attorneys busied themselves with documents, Marceline stepped away from Rachel and crossed the lobby. She moved slowly, deliberately, until she was standing just a few feet from Vivian. "Mrs. Mason," she said evenly. Vivian's eyes flicked toward her, faintly amused. "Miss Du Bois, I suggest you save your breath for the stand." Marceline reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a thin manila envelope. She held it out, not aggressively, but with the calm of someone offering a choice. "What's this?" Vivian asked, though she made no move to take it. "Something you'll want to see before we go inside." For a moment, Vivian's curiosity betrayed her composure. She took the envelope and slid a single sheet of paper from within. It was a printed transcription, clipped to a USB drive. "This is the conversation you had with Silas," Marceline said, her tone measured. "The one Dean recorded. It's not just your voice. It's every word about Jonas, the shares, and keeping him in that wheelchair. I've already made copies." Vivian's eyes narrowed. "Blackmail? Leverage?" Marceline corrected. "I'm offering you a way out. Sign the document inside. Full withdrawal of all charges against me, immediate, and this never sees daylight. Refuse, and it goes to the press by nightfall. I don't care how many lawyers you have. Once this is out, you'll never control the narrative again." The two women stood in the middle of the lobby, the buzz of the courthouse fading around them. Vivian's mask didn't just crack, it slipped entirely. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, darted between Marceline's face and the envelope as if weighing the cost of every possible move. "You think I'll be cornered by someone like you?" Vivian murmured, voice low enough to be swallowed by the marble walls. "I think you're smart enough to know when you've been beaten," Marceline replied. "And you know exactly how much you stand to lose if this gets out. I'm not asking for anything else. Just leave me and Jonas alone." Vivian tapped the envelope against her palm, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You're bluffing," she said, but there was no conviction in it. "Then call it," Marceline said simply. "We'll both see who walks out of here with something left to protect." The tension between them was a taut wire, ready to snap. Vivian's gaze lingered, searching for a crack in Marceline's resolve. There was none. After what felt like an eternity, Vivian slid the envelope back under her arm without a word. She turned on her heel and walked away, her attorneys trailing behind her. Rachel crossed the lobby to Marceline's side. "What did she say?" "Nothing," Marceline replied, watching Vivian disappear into the courtroom doors. "But she's thinking, and that's enough for now." The air in the lobby felt different, heavier somehow, but also charged with the possibility that the balance had shifted. The outcome was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. Vivian Mason was no longer as sure of her victory as she had been that morning. The courtroom was packed, the kind of airless crowd that made even the smallest sound carry. Rows of reporters leaned forward with their notepads, eyes fixed on the polished oak bench where the judge presided. The hum of anticipation was almost louder than the quiet shuffle of papers. Vivian sat at the plaintiff's table in a tailored navy suit, her posture sharp, every movement deliberate. Her legal team had spent the last 40 minutes painting Marceline as unstable, reckless, and emotionally unfit to be around Jonas. They produced selectively edited photos, anecdotal testimonies from hired witnesses, and a carefully crafted narrative that made Marceline sound like a ticking time bomb. From the back rows, the murmurs were clear. People were buying it. Rachel leaned toward Marceline. "They've stacked the deck," she whispered. "But decks can be turned. When the opposing counsel finished, Rachel rose. "Your Honor," she began, voice calm but carrying just enough weight to draw every eye. "We have a piece of evidence directly relevant to the motivations behind these charges. With the court's permission, I'd like to play it now." The judge adjusted his glasses, glanced at the other table, and nodded. "Proceed." Rachel walked to the media cart, inserted a USB, and pressed play. Dean's shaky but clear recording filled the room. Vivian's voice came first, cool and calculated. "Get that woman out of Jonas's life before she ruins everything. Silas will never know. As long as that boy stays in the wheelchair, he stays dependent. That keeps him, and the company, right where I need them." The words landed like a slap. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Heads turned, eyes widened. Even the court reporter paused for a fraction of a second before resuming her furious typing. Marceline didn't look at Vivian. She didn't need to. She could feel the sudden shift in the room, the crack in the facade. At the back of the courtroom, Silas sat rigid, his eyes fixed on Vivian. The disappointment there was unmistakable, edged with something darker, betrayal. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. Vivian tried to recover. "This isn't edited." The judge cut her off. "Mrs. Mason, you will remain silent until addressed." He turned to Rachel. "The court will recess for 15 minutes to review this evidence in full." The gavel came down, and the buzz swelled. Reporters scrambled for the doors, already composing their headlines. Rachel turned to Marceline. "We've got her. This is it." But Marceline's gaze was steady, her mind already somewhere else. When the judge returned and the court came back to order, Rachel stood, prepared to drive the nail home. Before she could speak, Marceline rose from her seat. "Your Honor," she said, her voice firm but warm, "I'm not here to destroy Mrs. Mason's life, no matter what she's done to mine. I only ask for my name to be cleared and to be allowed to see Jonas again. I don't want revenge. I want what's best for him." A hush fell. It was the kind of statement that hung in the air, unshakable. No theatrics, no bitterness, just the truth laid bare. From the gallery, a shift was palpable. The same faces that had been skeptical an hour ago now looked at her with something close to respect. The press would eat this up, but not as a scandal. This would be a redemption story. The judge made a note, then adjourned for the day, citing the need to review the new evidence. The official decision would wait, but the tone of the case had changed entirely. As the crowd began to file out, Silas stood and moved toward her. His approach carried no tension, no shield of arrogance. He stopped just beside her, close enough for her to catch the faint scent of cedar from his cologne. His hand rested lightly on her shoulder. "We'll talk," he said quietly, almost as if to himself. As two people on the same side. Jonas's side. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't trust. But it was the start of something that had seemed impossible just days before. A common ground. And for Marceline, that was more than enough to walk out of the courthouse with her head high. A week after the trial, Charleston felt quieter, as if the city itself had exhaled. The headlines had already shifted to other stories, but the remnants of the scandal still lingered in whispers and knowing glances. Vivian Mason had formally withdrawn every accusation against Marceline and announced her resignation from the Whitfield Mason Properties Board. The news was short, almost clinical, but it carried the weight of a silent verdict. She had lost. Inside corporate circles, the fallout was harsher. Vivian now faced an internal investigation into her misuse of authority for personal gain. Partners who once praised her sharpness began to distance themselves, their statements cold and impersonal. The same society pages that once lauded her philanthropy now ran subtle but unmistakable critiques of her overreach. For Marceline, the outcome felt less like a victory lap and more like a long exhale. The official documents clearing her name arrived in the mail 2 days later. The black and white language stark against the weeks of chaos that had led here. The calls started almost immediately. Exclusive interviews, morning show invitations, op-eds begging for her side of the story. She declined them all. It wasn't fear of speaking. It was knowing that Jonas's face would be dragged back into headlines, his name dissected alongside hers. That wasn't what she had fought for. One mild afternoon, she sat with Rachel on a bench at Waterfront Park, watching sailboats cut quietly across the harbor. The spring breeze carried the scent of salt and blooming jasmine. Rachel handed her a coffee. "You know," Rachel said, "you could have taken her apart completely, publicly. People would have cheered for it." Marceline let the thought linger before answering. "Not every win is about crushing the other side," she said softly. "Sometimes it's about knowing when to stop, so you can keep what matters most." She didn't have to name it. Both of them knew she meant Jonas. Rachel gave her a long look, then smiled in a way that carried both respect and a trace of disbelief. "You're a better person than most of my clients." In the days that followed, a new rhythm began to form. Silas, for all his stubbornness, started rearranging his calendar. Meetings were pushed, travel reduced. He was there at Jonas's therapy sessions now, not hovering, but watching, learning. What surprised Marceline more was his invitation for her to be part of the process. The same man who had once seen her as a threat now asked her to work with the therapists to design activities Jonas might actually enjoy. They brought in music, games, even small challenges that blended fun with movement. One afternoon, she arrived at the Riverside Path, where Silas often brought Jonas for fresh air after therapy. The late light turned the water to gold, and the sound of seagulls drifted overhead. Jonas spotted her from a distance and waved so enthusiastically that his wheelchair wobbled slightly. He rolled toward her on the brick path, cheeks flushed from the breeze. "Guess what?" he said, his voice bubbling with a kind of energy she had missed for months. "I think I can stand for a little." Her smile came without effort. "You want to try now?" He nodded, gripping the armrests for balance. Silas stood just behind him, his hands ready but his expression calm. There was no command, no tension, just quiet trust. Marceline knelt beside Jonas, taking his small hands into hers. "Okay, 1, 2, 3. Jonas pushed, his legs trembling under the effort, but he rose an inch, then another. His face lit up, not from how far he got, but from the fact that no one was stopping him. The morning light poured into the living room at Harborview Estate, soft and golden, catching in the polished curves of the grand piano. Outside, the spring air carried the faint scent of wisteria drifting through the open windows. Inside, Jonas sat on the bench, a pair of crutches leaning casually against the instrument. His fingers danced over the keys, coaxing out a gentle, playful jazz tune, one he and Marceline had been practicing for weeks. Marceline stood a few steps away, her shoulder almost brushing Silas's. It was still strange to think how far they had come from that first day. The shouting, the distrust, the walls between them. Now, the silence between them wasn't cold. It was companionable, filled with the quiet understanding of people who had weathered the same storm and were still standing. They didn't have to say it out loud, but the truth hung there between them. They were no longer just coexisting for Jonas's sake. They were working together, leaning, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes instinctively, toward the same goal. This wasn't about job titles or boundaries anymore. It was about building something steady, something that could last. Silas broke the quiet first, his voice low enough that Jonas wouldn't hear. "I used to think staying was a weakness," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the boy at the piano. "That walking away was the braver choice. But it turns out staying takes a hell of a lot more strength." Marceline's lips curved into a small smile, the kind that came from recognition rather than triumph. "It does," she said. But it's worth it. They stood there for another moment, the music filling the space between them, until Jonas hit the last note and let it linger. He turned toward them with a kind of grin that made it impossible not to smile back. "Hey," he said, his voice carrying just enough excitement to make Marceline tilt her head in curiosity. "I've been thinking. I want to join the wheelchair basketball league. And," he glanced at Silas before looking straight at her, "I want you to coach me." Marceline laughed, a short, surprised sound that turned into something warmer. "Me? You sure you're ready for that kind of tough training?" Jonas nodded firmly. "You're the only one who won't go easy on me." She shot Silas a quick look, and to her surprise, he didn't frown or try to redirect the idea. Instead, he gave the smallest of nods, almost imperceptible, like a silent pass of the torch. "All right," she said, crouching so she was eye level with Jonas. "If we're doing this, you have to promise me one thing. No quitting when it gets hard." Jonas's grin widened. "Deal." Somewhere in the middle of that exchange, the weight of the last few months seemed to lift, replaced by the sense that they were, at last, standing on solid ground. If there had been a camera, it might have pulled back then, gliding through the wide windows into the blooming garden beyond. The sound of Jonas's laughter mingled with the low hum of Silas's voice and Marceline's quiet chuckle, carried on the spring breeze. It was not the kind of family anyone could have predicted, not by blood, not by tradition, but one they had chosen, piece by piece, through every hard conversation and every act of staying. And as the morning light spilled across the room, it felt like a beginning, not an ending. Sometimes, the hardest battles aren't the ones we fight against others, but the ones inside ourselves. The decision to stay, to forgive, and to keep building something worth protecting. This story reminds us that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who choose to stand by each other when it matters most. What about you? Have you ever stayed when walking away seemed easier? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our next story.